Hello, we're so glad you joined us for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the pandemic, we hope that these virtual walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area. Today I'd like to introduce Karen Howard, whose garden walk invites us to explore garden ways, professional tips on design and plant selection. Karen Howard comes from a long line of artists, and she has followed in their footsteps. Karen's company, Howard Gardens Designs, is a full-service residential, architectural, and landscape design firm that combines her interests in houses and gardens. Karen is a registered architect in New York and Massachusetts, a landscape designer, and a Massachusetts certified horticulturist. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thanks for joining today. I am a garden designer. My work is mostly residential and mostly in suburban areas. Because of this, the gardens I work on are relatively small-sized gardens. When I design a garden, there are specific goals that I address in a certain order as I'm working on, first, the enclosing of the larger garden, particularly private spaces with evergreen plants and trees. Like this image I'm showing, that is a planting at the edge of a property. The second goal is to divide the larger garden into a series of smaller spaces within the greater garden. Here, the larger lower lawn is divided from the rectangular lawn between the two large beds by a stone wall. The walls and the beds themselves create this rectangular space at the center of the image. A third garden space is the lawn walkway that runs along the rear of the garden and around to the left-hand side at the edge of the property. To create divisions within the garden, the tools I use are enclosure with plants and the ground surfaces such as paving, lawn, and ground cover to define smaller spaces within the larger garden. In this image, the circle of the lawn is an entry garden that defines the center of the garden space. Evergreens of various heights around the edge of the circle help to further define this space. To enclose the garden and break up the space, I use some methods of placement to decide where to put the plants into the design. I will touch on the importance of foliage texture and color contrast so plants are differentiated from one another within the garden. And lastly, I will mention some specific plants I use in my designs. I use native plants in my designs and try to steer clients toward using them. I think that native plants make a quieter and more understated garden, but of course there are so many environmental advantages that come with using native plants. Gardens and landscapes are often enclosed, as shown here in this medieval garden, the cloisters in New York, or in Olmsted's work. Here is Central Park, where heavily planted edges enclose the park. These plantings and the manipulation of terrain control views and create an illusion of privacy. Or here is the private garden of Piet Udolf, which is enclosed by clipped hedges. To talk about my approach to design and the sequence I use to add plants to the design and where to put them, I'm going to use a prototype. This is an image of the prototype project finished. It is a private garden space around a newly constructed garage and covered terrace. The house is to the left off this light, and when we started work on this project, the site had been mostly stripped of plants. This is a plan of the site when we began work on it, on the design. Here's the new garage and the covered garden space that's attached to it. The house is here. The front of the site is off the top of the slide, and there were a few large plants that remained, a sugar maple here and some large evergreen trees on that side of the site. When I'm designing, let me just go back to say one thing. The elements that I needed to add into this rear garden were the driveway, walkway, and the private garden area, which would be right here. To create these spaces, I use enclosure and surfaces like paving, planting beds, and lawn to define these spaces and divide the garden into separate spaces. When I'm designing a driveway, I treat it as a separate garden space. Perimeter plantings, the paving shape and patterns can be beautiful and compelling and add significantly to the landscape. Here, the level of the driveway over here is about 2 feet below the private garden that's on the left of the house behind these trees. The driveway level is lowered to 2 feet below that private garden at the side of the house beyond the cars. The paving area is enclosed on 3 sides, first by the high elevation of the rear garden, and then berms on the other 2 sides. The surface of paving in the garden along with enclosure can make separate space within the larger garden. A carefully shaped surface of lawn with enclosure by plants in beds at its edges can make a space within a garden. A garden space can be defined by ground cover and plantings. This garden space is at the side of the house in a prototype project. Its stepping stones lead to the lawn in the rear of the private garden, which you can see just beyond the planting in the foreground. The ground cover, with its surface of mulch and the addition of higher plants like the bottlebrush buckeye, differentiate this section of the garden from the lawn beyond. Here's the prototype plan again, with the driveway inserted on the right-hand side, the walkway that connects the house and the covered garden space, and the main rear garden on the left, with the lawn and focal point of the pool. The existing evergreens are shown as the transparent darker green irregular shapes. The driveway is separated from the private garden by a stone walkway connecting the house, garage, and covered garden space, and it makes an entry to the private garden. The next slide is a view of this garden starting from about this location and looking in this direction. Here's the lawn at the center of this garden space. And I just want to say a few words about lawns in garden designs. I generally use them to define centers of spaces. I shape them to divert attention from the perimeter. You can see here there's no correspondence between this circuitous bed edge and the rectilinear edge of the property and the garden. Doing this and the placement of plants to conceal the outer edge of the garden can give an illusion of greater space inside the garden. Here's another example of keeping the outer edge of the garden and the edge of the lawn inside it disassociated or unrelated. This is the site before, and you can orient yourself by looking at the telephone wires here and the roof of the garage over here. Here's the same view, essentially. The lawn in this garden is rotated at a 45-degree angle to the property line, 20-foot square. I also advocate keeping the lawn area minimal. I think of the property as planting beds in which to put a small bit of turf or none at all. Another function of lawns is to provide circulation. Once established boundaries for separate spaces are determined, the spaces need to be delineated. In areas that are to be private, I aim to enclose the garden spaces with enough evergreens to completely screen the view, as shown in this image. In areas that are more public, such as this entry garden, I enclose this space with enough evergreens to express the separate space within the garden. This front garden is on a busy street. The owners wanted the enclosure of the wall. The plants next to them add to the enclosure of this space. The reduced height of many of them keeps the planting from becoming too much of a barrier and keeps the entry garden welcoming. Evergreens give enclosure and privacy in all seasons. In New England, 5 months of the year, deciduous plants have no leaves, and herbaceous plants cannot be seen at all. Because of this, and because I work on smaller gardens, I'm always searching for compact and narrow evergreen plants. So now we're going to move back to the prototype plan. The first plants I put in the design are the large woody plants and evergreens that enclose the garden. And you can see the large woody plants indicated here and the evergreen plants indicated by the darker plants around the edges and dividing the driveway area from the private garden area, and a few more around this edge to create some enclosure at the corner of the house. This prototype plan project did not require a great deal of perimeter planting, so here's an example of another project to show some of the plants I used to create enclosure for privacy at the garden edge. Here's Pinus strobus, fastigiata, Thuja occidentalis techni, and right at the corner here is Thuja occidentalis de Groot's spire. I'm just going to run through some of these evergreens that I use to give you an idea of which plants you might use for this job. This is Pinus strobus fastigiata. These are very old plants, and you can see they do get very large, even though they're not as wide as the straight Pinus strobus. Another option would be to use this one, Pinus strobus stobpillar. It only gets 5 or 6 feet wide and 20 to 30 feet high. This is the Thuja techni that I showed you in the slide. This is Holmstrop, which is another Thuja occidentalis, but is much smaller and narrower than the techni. only about 4 to 5 feet wide. So this is an advantage when you're trying to keep a screen planting at the edge of a property to a minimal depth. This is DeGroote spire on either side of this gate. It's a very narrow arborvitae, only 3 to 4 feet wide. Here's Samargood arborvitaes, Thuya occidentalis, and here it is in that same view of the garden I showed you previously. These are Samargoods, 3 here and 1 back here. Very soft green foliage and pointed tops. So another good evergreen to use at edge planting is Juniperus virginiana emerald sentinel. This one does get to 6 to 8 feet wide, so this might even be a better choice. Juniperus virginiana Taylor, only 3 to 4 feet wide. And lastly, Ilex opaca. This is a fairly wide plant, so when it's used right here, it's taking up quite a bit of space, but it works in this rear garden. I often add deciduous plants to evergreen plantings to lighten up the appearance of the planting and make it less static. This is liquid ambar, slender silhouette. It grows to only be 6 to 8 feet wide. Some people find these plants a little strange looking, kind of Dr. Seuss-y, and they are in many ways. And I find grouping them in groups of 2 or 3 instead of just putting a single plant can help with this issue. Another deciduous plant I like very much to use, Amelanchier grandiflora autumn brilliance. Adding the smaller evergreen into the mix is the next step. We're back to the prototype project. These are useful for dividing space within the larger garden. The trees between the driveway and the private garden, these 2 trees, are underplanted with small inkberries. Here's an image of what they look like below the trees. This arrangement suggests a wall across this part of the space with a doorway in it, framed by the plants that create the entrance. Adding smaller evergreens to support the larger plants increases the enclosure of the overall garden and the definition of separate garden spaces. Another example of the work that small evergreens can do in defining space are the clipped boxwoods at the corner of the garden, the garden here and the rectangular lawn inside them. The boxwoods you can see show up well in winter, and they're barely visible in the summer, but they do play that important role in the winter. Here are some of the smaller evergreens I like to use in my designs. This is a new one that's come out in the last few years. Ilex Glabra gem box, only 2 to 3 feet high and wide. It has very tiny, fine foliage, which is a nice contrast with some bolder foliage in the planting. This is Ilex Glabra on the right of the gem boxwoods. This grows to be about 4 to 5 feet high and wide. And this is a very old, probably species inkberry, and you can see how large it is. It's about 6 to 8 feet high and wide. This one doesn't get much maintenance or pruning. If it did, it could probably be kept to a more compact shape, but you can see that you can also use this plant for a screening at a significant height. Here's Ilex Glabra Shamrock in a planting. These probably, they are in an irrigated bed. They probably don't need irrigation, and they tend to become quite leggy with a lot of growth at the top when they get as much water as they get in an irrigated bed. So in the past, we've had to do pruning to thin out the tops to keep the bottom stems from becoming too exposed. This is one of my favorite evergreen, broadleaved evergreen plants, Rhododendron Carolinian. It is one of the parents of the famous and ubiquitous PJM rhododendron, but it has much smaller leaves, you can see right here, than the large leaf rhododendron, and the flowers are very delicate and diminutive. This is Leucothea axillaris. It's 3 to 4 feet high and 5 to 6 feet wide in the foreground on either side of the walk. It has a nice bold texture that's useful for getting foliage contrast in the garden. This is Leucothea fontanzinea, Gerard's rainbow. The variegation is a nice addition when you're looking for more contrast between the different types of foliage in the garden. The next type of plant I add into the garden, after all the larger evergreens, woodies, and smaller evergreens are planted, are the deciduous shrubs. And these are represented in the plan by the lighter green circles. These are used to further reinforce the enclosure and the division of garden spaces. And also they bring in, the deciduous plants bring in much more dramatic leaf color and texture contrast. And so that's a wonderful addition to have into the planting, because the evergreens can be a little static sometimes. Deciduous plants also offer floral color at different times during the season. This in the very front, you can see this bright green leaf color added into this planting. This is Physocarpus opuliforus darts gold. Hydrangea quercifolia Alice has beautiful bold foliage and amazing fall leaf color. I find that some of the new smaller cultivars of a Hydrangea quercifolia don't quite have the same spectacular fall leaf color that the larger varieties have. Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle is another good workhorse in the garden, and there are also many different species developed from this, not species, but cultivars developed from this that are available on the market today. The variegated plant on the lower half of the slide is Cornus sericea silver and gold. I like plant variegation. Some people find it a little bit too visually intrusive, but this is an option if you do like it and want to use it in the garden, and it's a native plant. Back to the prototype plant again. The last step is to add in the herbaceous perennials. These continue to reinforce the design as the deciduous shrubs do, but on a smaller scale. The perennials step down the height of the plantings toward the inner edges of the beds and further reinforce these bed edges. Here we have ostrich ferns, Chrysogonum green and gold, and Pacara aurea. Some of the herbaceous perennials add to the design additional variety. These are indicated, oh, I lost my place here. Perennials added to the design add additional variety. Some of the herbaceous perennials I like to use are American Cranberry, shown here in the center in the upper part of the slide. It has fine foliage shown. that's shown. I've used it in vegetable gardens that have been irrigated. I don't know how it would work in an area that's unirrigated. I've also used it, as you can see here, at the edge of water gardens. It has fine, neat foliage that's a great foil for grasses and medium-sized and larger leaves. Another plant I like to use a lot is Amsonia hubrichtii for the beautiful fine foliage and then gorgeous fall color. Asclepias tuberosa is another one, an easy plant. I find it seeds around the garden, which is nice because you can move the seedlings early in the spring and expand its use in your garden. Pennsylvania carex is another one I like very much. It can be used as an underplanting in perennial beds, or you can use it in large areas for ground cover. It's a very pretty, delicate carex. Iris cristata, here it's mixed in with some chives, but a good view of it, the flowers in bloom. Cinnamon fern, Packera aurea. And here's Rudbeckia triloba and Lobelia cardinalis. I just tried using this Rudbeckia triloba, brown-eyed Susan, in my garden a few years ago. It moves around a lot. I find the plants are not often perennial, but that it's a pretty prolific seeder. So if you watch for the seedlings in the early spring, you can move it to a location where you want it in the garden, and you will have something by the end of July that is 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Now I want to jump to some methods I use to locate plants within a design. To do this, I'm going to use an imaginary plan. You can see here there's an outer boundary, and I have planting beds shown in brown and the lawn shown in green. This aerial shot of Sissinghurst in early spring clarifies what I will talk about, and what I think about first is adding the structure bones and framework into the garden, enclosures and divisions made of evergreen or large woody plants. Here's the same shot in summer when the deciduous plants and herbaceous plants add, complement, and embellish the design. This is a formal garden, but the same principles apply to the structure of any garden being created in a temperate zone. So back to this imaginary plan. When I'm putting plants on the outer edge to create privacy, I put them in a zigzag arrangement, usually. This nestles the plants together, and when I do that, I think about the colors of the foliage, even though a lot of the time it's very subtle in conifers, unless you're going to use white or gold tipped ones. But you can see where I've grouped them in 3 and 2 and zigzag them. These are conifers at the outer edge of the planting I showed you before, and you can see how they move back and forth along the edge of the planting. Doing this, zigzagging the plants, creates pockets for other plants that can be added in a similar manner next to the first ones and just inside them. But instead of doing this, what I do next is move to the inner edges, thinking about expressing the inner edge of the bed in winter. And I leave the remaining unplanted bed to be filled in with deciduous shrubs and herbaceous perennials. At this stage, I am also thinking about defining the inside corners, such as these, and the outside corners of the plan. Adding additional evergreens to strengthen the demarcation of the corners makes the design more apparent. So here you can see I've added them to reinforce the statement of the first large evergreen. Here, all the evergreens are shown. The enclosure at the outside is giving privacy. The definition of the inside, outside corners and edges are delineated with groups of evergreen plants. So what I'm thinking about when I'm doing all this placement at the beginning is what will show in winter. Will the design be seen? Now I'm going to just touch on entrances, exits, and openings, the divisions between garden spaces. In this image, the main division or wall is the yew hedge, you can see, moving this way. To that is added the stone threshold down here, the pair of containers symmetrically arranged that frame the opening. And each of these design moves as the message that this space is significant and important, that is a doorway, a transition from one space to another. Garden doorways often involve evergreen and woody plants. As you can see, the doorway at the center of this slide. You see framing overhead by the trained woody plant and the pair of clip boxwoods symmetrically framing the opening. In this image, the doorway is expressed by symmetrical posts at either side of the opening and the change in ground surface from turf to gravel. Here are two doorways abstractly shown in plan. I have a pair of blue-green hollies on the right, and this is a symmetrical or formal framing of an opening or a doorway. The rhododendrons at the bottom of the slide also frame an opening. There's a pair of two with two additional ones added on the left to break down the symmetry and make this framing more informal or naturalistic. In the first framing with the hollies, this is a technique I often use in entry gardens where the focus is the front door of the house. Here's an example of that. Small wood, the trees on either side of the walk, just inside the pair of piers, frame the front walk as it meets the sidewalk. This symmetry is reinforced by the matching groups of yews below the trees. I might repeat an arrangement similar to this, but with different evergreen plants again near the front door to keep the front door as the focal point of the entry garden. The second framing technique, less formal and more naturalistic, is useful for transitioning between strong symmetry into asymmetry. As you can see here, the planting adjacent to the rhododendrons becomes a naturalistic arrangement of shrubs around a small tree. This image also shows the reinforcement of the design around the hollies, adding more symmetrically placed evergreens around the hollies strengthens the design statement. This would be a good time to send any questions you have in that you would like to have discussed after the presentation. So back to the doorways. Here is a garden doorway in an interior division in a larger garden. It is a complex mix of symmetry and asymmetry, which makes it intriguing. The wall has arborvitaes symmetrically situated at each end. The door is cut asymmetrically in the wall. The door is framed asymmetrically by 2 plants of different types, colors, and sizes. Preceding the doorway, 2 short stone plinths are symmetrically placed on the opening. So just to review some of my recommendations about ways of making a garden: enclose the garden and its interior spaces with evergreen so that its structure can be seen throughout the year. Locate evergreen plants so they express edges, corners, and doorways all season long. Use surfaces to define space, like paving and lawn. Define circles, just defined areas, large defined areas of paving, and ground cover. And while doing all this, pay attention to flowers for their shape, size, and time of bloom, and foliage colors and textures to create rich compositions with plants. Thanks for listening.
That was very, very nice, Karen. Thank you so much for all these wonderful ideas. We do have a few questions. Are any of the evergreens that you mentioned native to North America?
I think all of the ones that I mentioned are native to North America. I mean, I've really tried to focus on that because I know that this is what you would be interested in. So they are cultivars of those. For example, white pine, the Stowe pillar I showed is a cultivar of the straight original white pine.
Very good. Can you talk a little bit about inkberry and whether or not it provides berries for birds?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's likely that it does, but I don't know the answer.
Well, if someone else who's listening in is familiar with that, perhaps they'll share that information. Let's see, we have many coming in here. Could you please mention if most of the evergreens are sun-loving or if any of them can tolerate some shade?
Most of them are sun-loving. That is always a problem when I'm trying to do a completely native garden, because when I'm doing a planting in shade and looking for screening, I usually have to resort to yews. And most of the yews that are tall, all of them that I know of are not native. The one native yew that I know of is only about 3 or 4 feet high and is more spreading like a ground cover. So that is definitely on my wish list.
All right, very good. How do you keep the ostrich fern from taking over the rest of the garden?
I think the only way that you can do that is by digging it up. And I think that's true of other plants, like I showed the Pachyra aurea, the chrysogonum. There are many plants that are native. As a matter of fact, a plant I didn't show at all called Canada anemone, we used in many of the gardens of our clients because it is a native plant, and it became such a problem. We had to remove every single speck of it. It was invading everywhere. It was growing up and into shrubs. So that's always something to watch out for, because even if it's a native, doesn't necessarily mean it can be managed in a garden.
That's a really, really good point. What is your recommendation for eliminating grass in gravel walkways?
Well, one thing you can do is scuffle hoe them a lot. I know that's an additional maintenance issue, but if you do that, it's usually much faster than weeding. I don't know. What I'm talking about is just disturbing the gravel with a tool. And if you have a tool that you can use while you're standing, you can do a pretty large area fairly quickly. And if that's done every 2 weeks or so, or even 3, that can keep the gravel pretty clear of weeds.
Very, very good. Does Carex pennsylvanica require full sun or shade?
It does not require full sun. I'm growing it in my garden now under almost all-day shade. It does get some bright light. I haven't tried it in dense shade, and when I've seen it growing, for example at Garden in the Woods. It was not in dense shade, but it's worth a try.
Yes, good suggestion. Can you repeat the various thuja or arborvitae cultivars that you're using?
Yeah, one I mentioned was Techni, and that's 10 to 15 feet high and 6 to 8 feet wide. So these are all Thuja occidentalis. Another one was Holmstrup, Holmstrup. That's 10 to 15 feet high, but only 4 to 5 feet wide. Another one is De Groot's Spire. That's only 3 to 4 feet wide. Again, the same height. And Smargood, same height again, but 4 to 5 feet wide. Smargood is Smaragd.
Thank you. Very good. How do you deal with deer in these beautiful landscapes?
Well, most of the time we don't have to deal with deer. A lot of the time what we do is choose plants that they don't like, but doing that, of course, is limiting your plant palette so much. Deer fence is always a good option if you can do that. I think you don't really need to put up something that is that visible to keep them out. If you had thin posts, for example, rebar, like a 8 to 10 foot rebar sunk in the ground, which give you a 6 to 8 feet wall, and then you space thin wires on it 12 inches apart, that might be pretty effective at keeping the deer away, but they're a problem.
Oh, yes, they are in many, many areas.
Yes, they are.
Any thoughts about privacy evergreens to block a neighbor's backyard? They have dogwoods and leatherleaf viburnum and very tall maples, but they're looking for something for that mid layer.
So it would be in a lot of shade, wouldn't
it?
Is
Judging
it
by
just,
this description, yes.
yeah, that's another area where I would resort to using yews. It's not a native plant, but it will grow in shade. It's extremely tough. They come in such an amazing variety of shapes and sizes.
Yes, good. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
This person is curious about landscaping with purpose and the intent to smooth a transition from the visual strength of sharp edges and the architecture of a home to the soft edges of the natural meadow beyond.
Well, I guess what I would do is I would do quite a naturalistic garden, and you could actually start closer to the house with plantings that were more apparently formal or planned by human beings. And as you moved out to the edges, you could actually have less and less control. So there might be fewer maintenance hours involved in maintaining that part of the garden, but to actually have it become less and less designed as you move away from the garden, the house, toward the meadow.
Okay, very good. What are your go-to plantings for shaded areas other than the evergreens?
Well, I would probably use some viburnums. You could use the bottle brush buckeye. A lot of these plants, even though they will grow in a lot of shade, will always look much better in sun. Some small native trees like, I don't know, sassafras or dogwood, the dogwood shrubs, those would work. They look more vital, and they'll be in the sun, but they will work in the shade.
Yes, that's probably a good choice. Can you recommend deciduous shrubs that are also good pollinator sources?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think that most native deciduous shrubs are good pollinator sources. Some, of course, are for a very, a great number of pollinators, and some are very specific with one, to one pollinator. I wish I could answer that question better, but that's the best I can do.
Okay. Can you talk about why you use cultivars? Is it mostly a matter of availability?
Cultivars as opposed to the straight species?
Yes.
It's for the characteristics that they offer. For example, being more compact. I mean, that was the main point I was making about the evergreens. They may lose something genetically when you go to a cultivar, but that is the reason I choose them. Because if a person has a small backyard that's, say, 50 by 50 feet, and I put in the straight white pines as a screen, pretty soon most of the backyard will be covered by white pines. Now that takes years, but it just seems like not a good plant to guide the client to put into that area unless they want that kind of coverage.
Yes, that's a really good point. One of our listeners mentioned that inkberries require a male and a female plant in order to berry. And several people said yes, inkberry does provide fruit for birds if you have both male and female.
It's very interesting when nurseries are selling plants, they specifically have male and female hollies listed, for example, and you buy both of them to put in the garden specifically for that reason. But I do not see that in the suppliers' lists for inkberries. So that's very interesting to know. I did not know that.
That is very interesting. Back to evergreens again. It's a popular topic. What is a good columnar shape evergreen that's somewhat dwarf?
Does it have to be for shade? I mean, was that a criteria?
That was not mentioned.
Oh. Well, let's see. There are some varieties of spruces that are somewhat, I don't really have a good answer for that. The main thing I would say is to look in the catalogs of suppliers. I spend a lot of time doing this, and I have found one supplier that lists a lot of unusual types of plants, and that is what I usually do when I have criteria like that, because if you go to people who supply the standard things, they just will not have them. So that's what I would do is usually very often in the catalogs, the plants are listed by type. So if you go right to the evergreen or conifer section, you can go see what's for available. Another important consideration always in choosing plants, the exact right type that would suit your garden as far as its characteristics may not be available in a reasonable size, because if you are putting a plant that's a 3-gallon conifer in a garden for screening, that is just not going to do anything. So that's another important thing to always check when you're designing is the availability of sizes of some of these specific things after you've focused on what kind of cultivars you think you might use or species.
Very good point. Can you talk a little bit more about circulation and how that influences your decisions?
Well, I think when you start a design project, you have to understand by talking to the client what kinds of necessary circulation and connections there are going to be in the garden. And this even goes to finding out if they have somebody come and mow for them, how the mower is going to get inside and outside of a garden if you have turf area, the width of the mower. So I think that gathering all the information you can about the circulation that's required is going to give you a lot of information to start with, and then the rest of it is design decisions beyond that. Beyond determining the function, the next step is the design.
Okay, very good. Is Chinese windmill good for Zone 7?
I do not know about that plant.
I don't either.
Chinese windmill. I think if you just used a search engine on the plant, you could get that information.
Yes, good point. Someone recommends white vinegar for the weeds and gravel. Thank you for that. Someone suggests that Carex pennsylvanica will grow in dense shade of New England forests, so thank you for that. Karen, what do you recommend for the ground surfaces along the driveway?
Outside the paving itself, I guess they're asking?
I think so. And then it goes on to say, do you recommend something that allows the rain to run off? I
think a lot of this has to do with the management of water, which is another thing that needs to be discussed before the design is implemented, because if you are gathering the water in a certain way, you need to provide for this before any planting or any paving that's done way at the beginning, because it involves such disruption. You could also create troughs at the edge of the driveway. I've seen that done with cobbles to direct the water to a certain place. It could be directed to a rain garden or a place where the water could perk back into the soil. I don't know if that's answered the question, but
yes, thank you.
Okay.
You mentioned that you liked rhododendron Carolinianum.
Yes, very
And
much.
could you elaborate on what characteristics you think are valuable?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think it's very beautiful. Second of all, it's a very easy plant to grow. It doesn't require a lot of attention once it's established. I guess those are the main things. Is its appearance and the fact that it's so easy to manage in the garden and to grow.
Okay.
And that it's native, of course, that it's native.
Yes, yes, very good. Do you use hemlocks very much in shady areas?
I haven't lately because of the woolly adelgid, but I think that there was a predator release for the woolly adelgid a number of years ago, and I've noted looking at hemlocks as I observe gardens that the woolly adelgid is still there, but many, many fewer hemlocks are affected than were before. So it's something that I would definitely consider doing because, of course, that was the go-to shade plant. Now, putting it on the edge of a property where you want to keep it narrow is never really good for the plant because people shear them and clip them and try to keep them 5 or 6 feet wide and less than 20 feet tall, and that's just not what a hemlock is. And when you do that to them, it stresses them so much that they usually are much more susceptible to disease then. So I would investigate maybe some smaller cultivars or using hemlocks in a garden as a focal point, as a specimen plant within the garden, I think could work very well, especially if it were a smaller cultivar.
Yes, very good. Can spruce trees be planted in the same spot where other spruce trees were removed and the roots ground?
I think yes, they can, just as long as they're planted correctly and they get enough water after planting. They should grow well, and the existing roots left in the soil, of which there would be many, would just decompose over time.
All right. Do you have suggestions for favorite bulbs that you put in for spring interest?
Well, I like some smaller bulbs, many of which are non-native. The one that I can think of that's native is Camassia, and that is native, I think, to the Midwest, and Native Americans used to eat the bulbs as a food source. It's a very large plant when it comes up, so I find it to look coarse in a smaller garden. But I think if you have the opportunity to use it in the larger garden, like if you had a space or a house where you had a wet meadow away from the house, they would be spectacular in a location like that.
Very good. And another listener is giving us a little education. Chinese windmill is a type of palm tree. It's not native to the United States, but it will survive in zones 8A through 11 and can withstand a brief period of snow. So, thank you for that. Can you remind us what the gold juniper was that was a columnar variety?
Yes. I think it was Emerald Sentinel. Oh, no, or Virginia Taylor. There were just two I mentioned.
Okay.
First one was Juniperus virginiana Emerald Sentinel, which is 15 to 20 feet high and 6 to 8 feet wide. And then there's a narrower one called Juniperus virginiana Taylor. That's 20 to 30 feet high and 3 to 4 feet wide.
Excellent information. In a small garden design, about how many different types of perennials would you recommend?
I really wouldn't approach it that way. I guess often at the beginning of the project, I start by just making lists of types of plants, like lists of trees, lists of conifers and broad-leaved evergreens that I might use for screening, right down to lists of perennials. And when I'm thinking of them for a specific garden, I'm thinking of the aspect of the garden, like does it get sun or shade? I'm thinking of the client's preferences for color. I'm thinking of variety of foliage types. So I might develop a list of perennials that might be fairly long at the beginning of a project. It might be like 25 or 30 plants. But as I am choosing those plants to put in the design, I'm picking certain ones for specific reasons, like maybe the height and shape. Maybe I want something very tall at the back of the garden, and of those 30 plants, there are only 5 that are very tall, and I choose one because the client says they love blue or something like that. Then I might pick it for that reason. And once I start putting them all in the beds, I'm eliminating some of those on the list simply by not choosing them, and that would be the appropriate number to use for that garden. Also, when you're inserting perennials, I would not put just one of something in unless it's a very large plant. I usually use what they would say is drifts of perennials, where you might put, for a very large one, you might put only one, but for the next size down, you might put 2 or 3. So, and then you might put 2 together and a third one in another place, so that there's some a cohesive appearance to the garden. And then for the smaller size, you might use, for example, the edge planting, where plants tend to be very small and maybe tighter unless they're transparent. You might use many more of those, like you might end up using 25 of one type of plant. And that's the way I would determine the number of perennials used in the garden, by the selection of them.
Very good. That's great advice. What blue spruce can you plant that's a beautiful blue and rather compact in height?
And it doesn't have to be native?
Native was not.
Yeah. I think there are some varieties like Picea pungens baby blue, or Picea pungens baby blue eyes, or Picea pungens bakeri, or one that's a little larger than those I just read was Picea pungens fat Albert. But the first 3 I mentioned have heights to, well, the small, I guess I should tell you the heights. The baby blue is 20 to 30 feet high and a spread of 10-15. The Picea pungens baby blue eyes is 10 to 15 feet high with a spread of 6 to 8. And the Picea pungens bakeri is 15 to 20 feet high with a spread of 8 to 10. So those 3 cultivars are the smaller ones.
Okay, that gives some good suggestions. It's been a lovely walk in the garden, and I really appreciate you sharing all of your design tips and plant selection tips. So thank you very much for taking us along this walk in the garden.
Well, thank you so much for having me.